Hello everybody. So going to talk about cricket here today. Sorry about the traffic noise there. So last night we had the conclusion of the World Test Championship. Now this is the first time I've ever had a World Test Championship final for cricket. And I don't think they have test matches in the same way for other sports. So normally test matches are 5-day affairs, have been since probably about the 1930s. Before that, of course, they were timeless and you just played 2 innings each and take as long as it took. They stopped doing that when they had one that went for like 14 days. But of course they didn't always do it then anyway. Sometimes they were 2 days, sometimes they were 4 days. It varied a little bit. So 5 days was settled on as a fair amount of time. Now the problem with this one was that we had a lot of rain. So the first day was completely washed out, rained all day, no play at all. Second day, it rained for half the day. Almost. They managed to get 56 overs in out of the normal 90, so a little bit less than half the day, but pretty close. Third day, I'm pretty sure the third day was washed out as well. Then the fourth day, they got a little bit of play. I think that's the right order. So basically we had about 1 day of play in the first 4 days. Like 1 day total, bit over 1 day out of 4 days. That's terrible. They lost 3 days. But for this match, they had a reserve day. Now they're allowed to do that. So then normally that'd be a 5-day test. So this doesn't become a 6-day test, but they just use a reserve day for it. They've had matches where they've had 2 reserve days, but this one only had 1. So with 2 days washed out, in fact realistically 3, they should have gone 3 extra days, but they only had 1. So anyway, so day 5, which would normally have been the last day, they had pretty much a full day, and then day 6, which was yesterday, they had the full day, and they just barely got it all finished. And this was a low scoring affair with both teams going in with an extra bowler, so 5 bowlers. New Zealand went in with for all pace with Colin de Grandhomme, the bowling all-rounder, fast bowling all-rounder, whilst India went in with 3 fast bowlers and 2 spinners, with Ravindra Jadeja as probably the all-rounder, although Ravi Ashwin, I can't remember what Ravi's short for. He's also a bit of an all-rounder, but not officially. So they both went in with an extra bowler, had their wicket keepers batting at 6, and that of course makes for lower scoring affairs. If we'd had our normal test lineup with 6 batsmen, a wicket keeper and 4 bowlers, it seems to me pretty unlikely that they'd get low enough scores to be able to finish the match in time, in the amount of time that we had. So that was a really critical thing. Like, for various reasons, both teams went in with extra bowler. Perhaps they thought it was an easy batting surface. That's usually what you do on an easy batting surface. You don't want to get a draw, so you are going with the extra bowler. Or sometimes if you want a little bit of variety with your bowling attack, or if you're worried that your bowlers might get fatigued from long bowling spells. So it's not normal. It's occasionally teams do it, and sometimes they have that 5th bowling option, maybe even a 6th, but they're not normally expected to bowl their full amount of overs, the same as everyone else. And yet in this match they did. So the big difference between the 2 teams was that India went in with 2 spinners, while New Zealand went in with none. 5 paces is really a lot. I mean, some teams do sometimes go in with 4, but your typical setup is 3 paces and 1 spinner, or you might go 4 paces and no spinners. Sometimes you'll go 2 paces and 2 spinners if it's a spin-friendly pitch. So India going with 3 paces and 2 spinners, that's a pretty normal sort of lineup. They could have gone in with 4 and 1, or they could have gone with 3 and 1. That would have all been pretty normal. So they're going in with that isn't really suggesting that they thought it was going to take spin. Rather, they were just saying, well, Jadeja is a pretty good bowler on all conditions, and also a pretty good batsman. And in fact, he's probably underutilised for India. He just doesn't fit in with their setup. Now, it was, just so people are aware, New Zealand were ranked number 1 on the ICC rankings at the time of this test match, and India were ranked number 2, which strangely enough was the same ranking order on the World Test Championship. So they're 2 different rankings. ICC rankings are based on the previous 3 years, and they have their official system. We've been using that for about 30 or 40 years. The World Test Championships table was quite controversial with how it was set up. It didn't look right at all. I objected to it a lot. They were rewarding more points for teams that won in short series and didn't care if it was home or away, and didn't care about any of the situations to do with it. The rather complicated ICC rankings do take into account all that. We've been fine-tuning that ranking system for decades, and whilst it had some problems early on, it's been pretty good for a while now. And we rely on it, we trust it, it's believable. This World Test Championship ranking just didn't make any sense. And so what ended up happening, and I mean, India was early on way ahead of everyone else, but then towards the end, so it was India and then Australia. We thought it was going to be India and Australia in the final, and then India had some bad results towards the end, and they looked like missing out. And then Australia had a bad result against India, which gave India a chance. And then, then New Zealand had some good results, and they snuck up there. And in the final Test series, I believe it was England versus India, and New Zealand already qualified, and it was out of India, England and Australia for that final spot, depending on how many matches each of them won. As it turned out, India won the series and they qualified. So Australia was third, I believe, and England was fourth, which strangely enough is the same as the ICC Test ranking. So 1, 2, 3, 4 are the same as in the official ranking. The only difference was the World Test Championship had it differently for 5, 6, 7 and lower than that, I believe. So that was the only real difference. Otherwise it was the same. In spite of having a really weird system, it ended up having the same. So we had New Zealand ahead of India. And had they done it through the ICC official ranking, would have been the same two teams. Now, it was played in England, which is supposed to be a neutral venue, but for people that know the conditions in cricket in different grounds in different parts of the world, England is very much like New Zealand. They're probably the two closest conditions that you get. There's no other condition really as close to New Zealand as England is. Even Australia is a bit further away, and South Africa further away again. Of course, India's conditions are quite similar to Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, probably Bangladesh closer than Sri Lanka. And I mean, Afghanistan and Pakistan, they don't play in anymore. So kind of or at the moment, never have played in Afghanistan. Probably a neutral venue would have been Pakistan if it was available, or probably more likely West Indies. So had they been trying to have a fair condition that's equally bad for both sides, they would have probably played in the West Indies somewhere. Now, I can't say if it would have been Barbados or Jamaica. It probably would have been Jamaica, I guess, as the biggest country in the West Indies, but it's hard to know. Kingston Oval, Jamaica could have hosted the World Test Championship and been fair to both sides. And obviously it would depend on what the two sides were as to who a neutral venue would be. Obviously, if it was between Australia and New Zealand, England would have been the right venue for a neutral venue between those two, because it's similar enough to both of them that it's fair. Or you could have had South Africa, or you could have had India, which all would have been, well, England would have been quite similar to both teams, South Africa would have been a little bit different for both, and India would have been very different for both, and they would have both struggled. Although India may have favoured New Zealand a little bit because of their better spin bowlers that Australia has. So, and I mean, that's the situation. If you had Australia and India as your two finalists, you probably still would have gone with West Indies. So I think that the organisers made a mistake in going for England from that point of view. They also made a pretty big mistake in going with England when it rained so much. And we didn't have covers. And what happened was that we had a lot of rain. We had the first day completely washed out. The second day rained a lot. From memory, the third or fourth day was completely washed out, and the other day had about half a day. I think it was the third day was washed out, fourth day had half a day. So we basically had 1 day of play in the first 4 days, and it's a 5-day match. But as it turned out, they had a reserve day, so we went into a 6th day. So a 6-day test, a bit unusual, but realistically they lost 3 days. So they should have gone to a 7th and even an 8th day. As it turned out, they just barely snuck home in the end. Oh my goodness. Just barely got there with 7 overs to go, about 20 minutes left. And we were hoping that light didn't come in like it had on the other days and ruined it, because it was past the scheduled closing time, except that it was extended because of the rain. New Zealand just they won just barely as far as time, but they had 8 wickets in hand. But they had a lot of chances in that last partnership, and I mean, a lot of little things could have made a big difference there, and it could have easily been India's game. And I think even with the last session to go, with 45 overs to go, India was still in with a fair chance. They were behind, but they were in with a fair chance. And even into the last hour, it was still some chance for India. Not much, but some. So I don't think we can say it was completely one-sided. It certainly wasn't like the 2005 Australia versus World team, which was the closest we've ever come to this, not counting the 1914 Tri-Series, which wasn't really very much of a World Championship, because it only had 3 teams. But the 2005 one, of course, that was very one-sided. It was a disaster. This one was almost a disaster because of rain. And I think if we had it to do again, that should have been held in West Indies. And I think we should have made it a timeless test. I know there is the option to have it covered, but a lot of people object to covered and lights and all that. But certainly I think a proper neutral venue. And I think for most countries, West Indies would have been a neutral venue. Obviously not for West Indies. Had West Indies made the final, I think you would have looked at who their opponent was to see who a good neutral venue was. West Indies and India final would have seen probably Australia as a good neutral venue for them. Whereas if it was West Indies and Australia, you might have gone to India. So it would really depend on who the different opponents were as to who the venue would be. But I do think West Indies represents a very different ground, or very different series of grounds, than both the subcontinent and the European or oceanic teams, or African teams for that matter. So yeah, that's probably what they should have been looking for a true neutral venue. And it did favour New Zealand, and they went with 5 paces, and I think that helped them not only to get a result but also to get a win. And Kyle Jamieson, man of the match, well and truly ahead of everyone else, especially early in the match when it mattered. Took crucial wickets, broke partnerships, and also took tail end wickets, and even had a bit of a bat at the end of the innings to give New Zealand the lead, which otherwise they might not have gotten. So well and truly the best player. There were a lot of other good performances. I think Kane Williamson got 50 and a 49, so he was probably pretty close, but probably not quite as crucial. And there were other good performances from both sides. I do think this is worth having a go at next time, and perhaps improving on it. It was good enough that it was interesting, but I think the rain issue was a big deal. Maybe England should be banned from hosting World Test Championships. But either way, even if they do, or even if it's someone else, I think it needs to be timeless. I don't think having 5 days, even with 1 rest day, is good enough. If this had been washed out, it would have been a disaster. Thankfully, they just barely got a result. Anyway, congratulations to New Zealand on being the smallest test country and beating the biggest test country in population and in popularity, most likely. Anyway, that's it from me. Bye-bye.